The universe was old, and it was full of life, and most of that life was fragile. The Galactic Concord had existed for over 12,000 years, a coalition of more than 4,000 spacefaring species bound together by diplomacy, trade, and the shared belief that war was something primitive, something underneath civilized beings. And for the most part, they were right. The Velith had never known violence, not in any meaningful way. Their homeworld of Sularara was a paradise of crystal forests and warm lavender seas, where the gravity was so gentle that their thin, translucent bodies could drift on the breeze like living glass. They were scholars, diplomats, singers of light, and they had never needed to be anything else. Senior researcher Talus stood at the observation deck of the GCS Lumenthal, watching the stars of the outer galactic rim spin slowly past the viewport. She had spent 9 years aboard this science vessel, cataloging stellar anomalies and mapping gravitational currents at the edge of known space. It was quiet work, peaceful work, and she loved it. But today, something was wrong. The readings on her console had started flickering 6 hours ago. Small distortions in the fabric of space-time, barely noticeable at first, like ripples in a pond, caused by a stone, dropped very far away. She had dismissed them initially, thinking they were echoes from a distant supernova, or perhaps a calibration error in the sensors. They were not. Talus, her assistant Veyun, called from across the lab, his crystalline voice trembling in a way she had never heard before. "You need to see this." She crossed the room and looked at his screen, and what she saw made her body go cold. Not the pleasant cold of Sulara's evening winds, but a deep, sick cold that reached into her bones and stayed there. The distortion was not a ripple. It was a wave, and it was massive, and it was moving. "That cannot be natural," she whispered. "It is not," Veyun said, his translucent fingers shaking as he pulled up the spectral analysis. "There are structures inside the distortion, billions of them, and they are moving against the rotation of the galaxy." Talus stared at the data, her mind racing. She had studied every known phenomenon in the Concord's vast scientific archive, and nothing, absolutely nothing, matched what she was seeing. These were not asteroids, not rogue planets, not any kind of natural formation. They were ships, or something like ships, biomechanical entities, each one the size of a small moon, moving in perfect coordination like a swarm of insects. They consumed everything in their path: stars, planets, moons, dust, breaking matter down into raw energy and using it to build more of themselves. "How many?" Talus asked, though she was not sure she wanted the answer. Veyun's voice cracked as he spoke. "Billions." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The hum of the Lumenthal's engines filled the silence, and somewhere deep in the ship, a maintenance drone clicked and whirred as it went about its routine, completely unaware that the universe had just changed forever. "Where is it heading?" Talus finally asked. Veyun ran the trajectory calculations twice, then 3 times, because he did not want to believe the result. But each time, the answer was the same. "Sulara," he said. "It is heading directly for Sulara." Talus felt her legs weaken beneath her. Sulara, her homeworld, where her family lived, where her daughter was learning to sing light for the first time, was directly in the path of something that ate stars. She did not waste another second. "Open a Priority 0 channel to the Concord High Assembly," she commanded, and her voice was steady, even though her heart was not. "Broadcast on all frequencies, every species, every station, every ship. Make them hear us." The signal went out at the speed of light, amplified by the Concord's vast relay network, reaching every corner of civilized space within minutes. It carried Talus's voice, her data, her warning, and her desperate plea for help. The responses came slowly. The Rithani, a proud avian species known for their beautiful plumage and their even more beautiful arrogance, sent back a request for additional verification of the anomaly's classification before they would convene their defense council. The Corvalli, an insectoid species with the largest industrial capacity in the Concord, acknowledged the signal, but stated that they would need to assess the economic implications before committing resources. The Dayun, aquatic telepaths who lived in the deep oceans of their water world, expressed concern and promised to meditate on an appropriate response. Species after species responded with caution, with committees, with questions, with delays. They asked for more data, more time, more meetings. They debated jurisdiction and protocol and chain of command. They did everything except the one thing Talus needed them to do. They did not act. Talus watched the responses scroll across her screen, and she felt something she had never felt before. Not fear, not sadness, but a burning frustration that made her want to scream into the void. And then, 11 minutes after her signal had been sent, one more response arrived. It did not come from any of the ancient species, not from any of the great civilizations that had been part of the Concord for millennia. It came from a small blue world on the inner spiral arm, a world that the Concord had only welcomed 47 years ago, a world that most species still whispered about with unease. It came from Earth. The message was short. It contained no requests for data, no questions about protocol, no suggestions for committee formation. It was 5 sentences, transmitted in clear galactic standard, and it read, "Acknowledged, fleet is mobilizing. All Terran forces have been placed on war footing. Hold your position and protect your civilians. We are coming." Talus read the message 3 times. Vayan looked at her with wide, frightened eyes and asked, "The humans, why did they respond so fast? How did they even understand what this is?" Talus thought about that question for a long time. She thought about what she knew of the humans, how they came from a world of crushing gravity and violent weather, a world filled with predators and poisons and diseases, a world that the Concord's classification system had labeled as a Class 12 death world, which was the highest danger rating any inhabited planet had ever received. She thought about how the other species had looked at the data and seen an anomaly, a curiosity, a problem to be studied and discussed. And she thought about how the humans had looked at the same data and seen something else entirely. They had seen a predator. They recognized it, Talus said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, and she could feel the weight of those words pressing down on her like gravity. The Deathworlders recognized the threat. The Lumenthal drifted in the silence of space, and far away the swarm moved closer, and farther still 300 human warships tore through the fabric of reality, racing toward a fight that nobody else was willing to join. The universe was old, and it was full of life, and most of that life was fragile, but not all of it. The alarms had started screaming in Geneva before Talus had even finished her broadcast. Deep beneath the old city, inside the armored bunker that housed the unified Terran command, a system that had been sleeping for decades suddenly woke up. It was called the Blackfall Protocol, and only 11 people in the entire human government knew it existed. Admiral Cale Drennan was one of them. He was sitting in his office when the alert hit his screen, not the Concord's polite distress signal, but the raw data feed that Terran intelligence had intercepted and analyzed independently. His coffee cup was still warm in his hand, and he set it down carefully, the way a man sets down something fragile before he picks up something heavy. "Get me the Joint Chiefs," he said to his aide, and his voice was calm, because Drennan had learned a long time ago that panic was a luxury no commander could afford. "And activate Blackfall." His aide, a young lieutenant named Torres, stared at him for a moment before responding. "Sir, Blackfall, are you certain?" "I read the data, Torres. I know what that swarm is. Get me the Joint Chiefs, now." Within the hour, every Terran military installation in the solar system and beyond was on full alert. Shipyards that had been running routine maintenance suddenly shifted to combat preparation. Reserve fleets that had been docked for years powered up their engines. Weapons systems that the Concord had never been told about were loaded into warships under black tarps and sealed containers. The Concord did not know about these weapons because humanity had never told them. This was not an accident. It was a decision made decades ago by people who understood something that no other species in the galaxy seemed to grasp. The universe was dangerous, and peace was not permanent. Drennan stood at the command table in the war room, surrounded by holographic displays showing fleet positions, supply lines, and the trajectory of the swarm. He was 63 years old, with gray hair cut short, and a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a gift from a piece of shrapnel during the Fringe Rebellions 15 years ago. He had seen combat. He had lost people, and he had carried the weight of those losses every day since. But he had never faced anything like this. "Tell me what we know," he said to the room. Dr. Anaya Osei, the head of Terran Xenothreat Analysis, stepped forward. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a voice that could fill any room without ever being raised. 32 years ago, she began, our anthropological teams discovered references in the deep Concord archives, files that had been sealed for thousands of years, forgotten by every species that had once read them. They described an event that occurred approximately 11,000 years before our time. She brought up a holographic display showing a star map with a long, dark scar across one spiral arm. A species called the Ashivan detected something moving through the void between galaxies, a swarm, biomechanical in nature, consuming everything in its path. The Ashivan sent a Priority Zero distress call to the Concord of their era. They begged for help. Drennan watched the display, his jaw tight. Nobody came, Osei continued. The Concord debated, delayed, and formed committees. By the time they agreed to act, the Ashivan homeworld had already been consumed. The swarm stripped their entire system down to dust and moved on. And then, Drennan asked. And then the swarm changed direction. It moved away from Concord space, out toward the galactic edge, and it disappeared. The Concord chose to believe it was gone forever. They buried the records, classified the archives, and pretended the Ashivan had never existed. But we found them. Yes, sir, we found them, and we did not pretend. That was the truth of it. When humanity had stumbled upon those ancient records, they had not reacted the way the Concord expected. They did not file reports or hold symposiums or write academic papers about the historical curiosity of a lost species. Instead, they had looked at the data, seen the pattern, and asked one simple question that apparently no other species had thought to ask in 11,000 years. What if it comes back? And then they had started building the Blackfall Protocol, was the result. A secret military contingency designed for exactly this scenario. New ship designs with heavier armor and more powerful weapons. New tactical doctrines built around fighting an enemy that outnumbered you by a factor of millions. New technologies that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible or even legal under Concord law. They had prepared for a war that might never come, because that was what humans did. They remembered their own history, a history written in blood and fire and survival against impossible odds, and they refused to be caught unprepared. How long until the fleet is ready? Drennan asked. The first and second expeditionary fleets can launch within 6 hours, Torres reported. 300 warships, 40,000 Marines, full combat loadout. The third fleet can follow in 18 hours as reserve. Drennan nodded, and turned to the holographic display showing the swarm's projected path. At its current speed, it would reach Sulara in approximately 72 hours. That gave the Terran fleet barely enough time to arrive, establish a defensive perimeter, and prepare for engagement. It was going to be close, and it was going to be bloody. Meanwhile, on the other side of the galaxy, the Concord High Assembly had finally convened, 7 hours after Talus's distress call. The great circular chamber on the station of Havanthos was filled with representatives of hundreds of species, all talking at once, all arguing about procedure and jurisdiction and the proper chain of command for responding to a threat that none of them fully understood. The Rithani ambassador, a tall creature with iridescent blue feathers and an expression of permanent superiority, stood at his podium and addressed the assembly with practiced disdain. "We must be cautious," he declared, his feathers ruffling with self-importance. "This so-called swarm has not yet been independently verified by Rithani sensors. I will not commit my people's fleet based on the panicked ramblings of a Velith researcher who may have misread her instruments." Several delegates murmured in agreement. Councillor Opaline, the Velith ambassador, stood at her own podium, her crystalline body trembling with emotion. She was old by Velith standards, her translucent skin tinged with the pale gold of age, and she had spent her entire career believing that the Concord would protect its members in times of need. That belief was dying in front of her eyes. "My people are in the path of annihilation," she said, her voice breaking like thin glass. "I am not asking for debate. I am asking for survival. Please, someone, anyone, help us." The chamber buzzed with whispered conversations, but no one moved. Then the doors at the back of the chamber opened, and Ambassador Elena Voss of the United Terran Nations walked in. She was not a tall woman, but she carried herself with the kind of quiet certainty that made tall people feel small. She wore the simple dark uniform of the Terran Diplomatic Corps, and her face showed no anger, no frustration, no pleading. Just a calm, steady resolve that was somehow more unsettling than any threat could have been. She walked to the Terran podium, looked out across the sea of alien faces, and spoke. "The Terran Expeditionary Fleet launched 4 hours ago," she said. 300 warships are currently in transit to Sularan space. They will arrive in approximately 61 hours, and will immediately engage the swarm. The chamber went silent. "We are not asking for your permission," Voss continued. "We are not asking for your approval, your resources, or your opinions. We are going because someone asked for help, and we are the kind of species that answers." She paused, and her eyes swept across the assembly. Past the Rithani with their beautiful feathers, past the Corvalli with their armored carapaces, past the Dayun floating in their water-filled enclosures. "You can debate," she said, and her voice was soft, but it carried to every corner of that massive chamber. "When you are ready to join us, you know where to find us, between the swarm and everything you love." Then she turned and walked out, and the doors closed behind her, and the silence in the chamber was so deep that it felt like the vacuum of space had leaked in. Somewhere in that silence, Councillor Opaline lowered her head and wept, not from despair, but from something she did not have a word for. It was the feeling of being caught in a storm and hearing footsteps coming toward you instead of away. Far from Havanthos, 300 Terran warships screamed through the void at faster-than-light speeds. The flagship UTCN Argos led the formation, and on its bridge, Admiral Drennan stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the stars blur into lines of white fire. "All hands," he said into the fleet-wide channel. "This is Admiral Drennan. Every species in the Concord evolved on Paradise worlds, low gravity, gentle weather, no predators worth mentioning. They never needed claws. They never needed venom. They never needed war. We did. And that is not our curse. That is our purpose. Tonight, we go to work. The fleet roared on, and the universe trembled at the sound of something it had forgotten, the sound of a predator racing not away from danger, but toward it. The Terran fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel on the edge of the Sularan system, and for one brief moment, everything was quiet. The kind of quiet that exists only in the seconds before something terrible begins. Admiral Drennan stood on the bridge of the UTCN Argos, staring at the tactical display, and what he saw made his stomach tighten. The swarm was already here. Not the full mass of it, not yet, but the vanguard, the outriders, the first wave of a storm that stretched across half a light-year behind them. The Velith defense flotilla had tried to hold. They had sent 60 ships to meet the vanguard, and now only 9 remained. The rest were scattered across the void in pieces, shattered hulls and frozen bodies drifting in the dark like leaves torn from a dying tree. "Status on the Velith survivors?" Drennan asked. 9 ships, sir," his tactical officer, Commander Hale, reported. "Most of them are badly damaged. They are falling back towards Sulara at best speed, but 2 of them have lost their engines entirely. They are just drifting. Get rescue ships to those 2 immediately. I want them towed behind our line before the swarm reaches them." "Yes, sir." Drennan turned his attention to the swarm itself. The outriders were enormous. Each one was a biomechanical entity, roughly the size of a continent, covered in organic armor that pulsed with a sickly amber light. They moved through space like living things, which they were, flexing and twisting their massive bodies as they advanced. Some of them trailed clouds of spores that glowed faintly in the dark, and others dragged tendrils of matter behind them, the remains of whatever they had consumed along the way. There were thousands of them, and behind them, the main body of the swarm was approaching like a wall of darkness. "All ships, battle stations," Drennan said into the fleet-wide channel. "Weapons free on my command. We are not here to study this thing. We are here to kill it." The Terran fleet surged forward. Aboard the damaged Lumenthal, Talus watched through her viewport as 300 human warships charged directly at the swarm, and she could not believe what she was seeing. Every tactical doctrine she had ever studied, every Concord guideline, every manual, every lesson, said that when facing a numerically superior enemy, you fell back, you regrouped, you maintained distance, and used long-range weapons to thin their numbers. The humans did not do any of those things. They flew straight into the swarm's formation like a fist through a window. The first volley of Terran weapons lit up the void. Railgun slugs the size of ground vehicles slammed into the outriders at a fraction of the speed of light, punching through organic armor and detonating inside the creatures' bodies. Missile salvos filled the space between the fleets with streaks of fire. Energy weapons carved burning lines across the swarm's front ranks. The outriders screamed, not with sound, because there was no sound in space, but with electromagnetic pulses that Talus's sensors picked up and translated into something her brain could interpret. It was an awful noise, like metal being torn apart underwater, and it made her entire body vibrate with revulsion. But the swarm did not retreat. It absorbed the damage, closed the gaps, and fired back. Corrosive spore clouds erupted from the outriders, spreading across the battlefield like living fog. Where the spores touched Terran hull plating, the metal began to dissolve, eaten away by biological acid. One destroyer took a direct hit from a gravity well weapon, a focused pulse of gravitational force that crushed the ship's midsection like a fist closing around an aluminum can. The ship broke in half, and its 2 halves spun away into the dark, trailing air and bodies. 22 Terran ships were destroyed in the first hour. But something remarkable happened in that same hour. The Terran fleet adapted. The humans had brought artificial intelligence systems with them, battle computers trained on centuries of human warfare simulations. These systems watched the swarm's attack patterns, analyzed them in real time, and began predicting where the next strike would come. Within 40 minutes, the Terran ships were dodging spore clouds before they were even launched, weaving through gravity wells with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. "They are learning," Talus whispered as she watched from the Lumenthal. "They are learning faster than the swarm can adapt." Commander Hale confirmed it from the Argos bridge. "Evasion algorithms are updating in real time, sir. Casualty rate is dropping. We have gone from losing 4 ships per engagement cycle to losing 1. Drennan did not smile, because 1 ship lost was still too many, but he nodded. "Push forward. I want us inside their formation. Get close enough that they cannot use those gravity wells without hitting their own." The fleet pressed deeper. Meanwhile, far below the capital ships, a much smaller operation was underway. Lieutenant Roa Vasquez stood in the airlock of a Terran assault shuttle, checking her weapon for the 3rd time, surrounded by 24 Marines in full combat armor. They were about to do something that no sane tactician would recommend. They were going to board one of the swarm's bioships. "Listen up," Vasquez said to her team, her voice hard and steady through her helmet speaker. "We are going inside that thing to find out how it works. Intelligence needs data on the swarm's internal structure, its communication systems, and any vulnerabilities we can exploit. We get in, we get what we need, and we get out. Nobody plays hero. Am I clear?" "Clear, Lieutenant," 24 voices responded in unison. The shuttle launched from the belly of a cruiser and dove toward the nearest outrider, a massive creature that had been partially disabled by railgun fire. Its armor was cracked open along one flank, exposing the pulsing, wet interior beneath. The shuttle slipped through the gap and landed inside the creature's body, and the Marines stepped out into a nightmare. The interior of the bioship was alive. The walls pulsed and breathed, covered in veins that carried glowing fluid in slow, rhythmic waves. The air was thick with heat and moisture, and it smelled like iron and rot. Bioluminescent growths provided dim, sickly light that made everything look like the inside of a fever dream. "Stay tight," Vasquez ordered. "Move toward the central mass. That is where the neural cluster should be." They moved through corridors that were not corridors, more like arteries, organic tunnels that shifted and contracted around them. Twice, the walls tried to close in, and the Marines had to cut their way through with plasma torches. And then they found something that changed everything. In the deepest chamber of the bioship, they discovered a massive wall of fused organic matter, and embedded within it were shapes that Vasquez recognized immediately as bodies. Not human bodies, not Velith bodies, but the remains of dozens of different species, their forms partially absorbed into the swarm's flesh, their neural tissue wired directly into the creature's nervous system. They were still alive, in some horrible partial way. Their mouths were open in silent screams, their eyes were moving, and faint electrical signals pulsed through what remained of their brains. "Oh God," one of the Marines whispered. Vasquez stepped closer to the wall, her scanner working frantically. The data that came back was horrifying. The swarm did not simply consume the species it encountered. It absorbed them, broke down their neural tissue, extracted their knowledge and memories, and integrated everything into its collective consciousness. The swarm was not just a predator, it was a graveyard that moved, a prison of minds that had been swallowed whole and never released. "Lieutenant, I am picking up something else," her tech specialist, Corporal Diaz, said from behind her. "There is a massive neural signature deeper inside the swarm, much deeper. These ships are all connected to a central processing node. The data calls it a nexus heart. Can you locate it? It is at the center of the swarm's main body, roughly half a light-year behind the vanguard. Everything flows from it, all commands, all coordination. If it goes down, the whole swarm goes down." Vasquez stared at the wall of screaming faces. and she felt something cold and hard settle into her chest. Not fear, but determination. These creatures, these people, had called for help once, just like the Velith, and nobody had come for them. "We are getting this data back to the Admiral," she said. "Move, now." They fought their way back through the bioship, losing 2 Marines to defensive organisms that emerged from the walls like nightmares made flesh. They reached the shuttle, launched out of the creature's body, and transmitted their findings to the Argos on an encrypted channel. Admiral Drennan read the report in silence. He looked at the images of the absorbed species, at the neural architecture diagrams, at the coordinates of the Nexus heart pulsing at the center of the swarm like a diseased sun. Then he looked at the tactical display showing the swarm stretching across half a light-year of space, billions of bioships between his fleet and that heart. Every Concord commander in history would have retreated at this point, would have fallen back to regroup, to plan, to wait for reinforcements that might never come. Drennan turned to his bridge crew and said, "Set course for the Nexus heart. All ships, we are going deeper." Commander Hale looked at him with wide eyes. "Sir, the concentration of swarm forces increases exponentially as we approach the center. Losses will be extreme." "I know. The Concord observers are advising an immediate withdrawal to—" "I know what they are advising, Commander. They have been advising caution for 11,000 years, and it got an entire species erased from existence. We are not doing that. Not today." He opened the fleet-wide channel one more time. "All ships, this is Drennan. We have located the enemy's brain. It is at the center of the swarm, and we are going to cut it out. I will not lie to you, the road between here and there is going to cost us. But every minute that thing keeps beating is another minute it is eating someone's world. So we go forward, because that is what we do. That is what we have always done. Drennan out." The fleet turned toward the heart of the swarm, and the darkness ahead of them pulsed with amber light, and 300 ships flew into it like sparks into a furnace. The deeper the Terran fleet pushed into the swarm, the worse it got. The Outriders at the edge had been enormous and terrifying, but they were nothing compared to what waited inside. The inner layers of the swarm were a churning ocean of bioships, so densely packed that the space between them was almost non-existent, like swimming through a living wall of teeth and acid and hunger. Ships were dying. The UTCN Relentless took a gravity well to its port side and folded in on itself like paper. The UTCN Corinth was swarmed by a cloud of parasitic organisms that bored through its hull and consumed the crew from the inside out. The UTCN Clearwater was hit by a spore barrage so massive that its entire outer hull dissolved in less than 30 seconds. Admiral Drennan stood on the bridge of the Argos and watched the casualty reports scroll across his display. Each one a name. Each name a ship. Each ship a crew of people who had families and lives and futures that were now gone. He felt the weight of every single one of them, but he did not waver, because wavering would mean stopping, and stopping would mean losing. "Push forward," he said, and his voice was hoarse but firm. "Maintain formation. Protect the carriers. We need those fighters in the air when we reach the heart." But the swarm was relentless. It did not tire, did not rest, did not retreat. It simply kept coming, wave after wave, an endless tide of biological horror that seemed to have no limit and no fear. And then the situation became even more desperate. A Velith medical ship, the Sulith Grace, had been trapped behind the advancing swarm lines. It was a civilian vessel, unarmed and unarmored, carrying 12,000 refugees who had been evacuated from the outer settlements before the swarm arrived. Most of them were children, elderly, and sick. People who could not fight, could not run, and had nowhere else to go. The swarm had detected the ship and was closing in from 3 directions. Captain Marin Thau of the UTCN Resolve received the distress call at 0347 hours. The Resolve was a destroyer, a small, fast ship designed for escort duty and skirmishing, not for holding off a swarm that numbered in the millions. Thao was 38 years old, with short black hair and calm brown eyes that never seemed to blink, even under fire. She looked at the tactical display and saw the situation clearly. The Grace was 12 minutes from being overwhelmed. The nearest Terran capital ship was 40 minutes away, and there was exactly one ship close enough to do anything about it. Hers. "Helm," she said, "come about. Put us between the Grace and the swarm. All weapons. Charge everything we have." Her first officer, Lieutenant Commander Park, looked at her with an expression that was not quite fear but something close to it. "Captain, we cannot hold that position alone. The swarm concentration in that sector is—" "I know what it is, Park. Those are 12,000 civilians on that ship, and most of them are children. We hold." The Resolve turned and accelerated toward the Grace, sliding into position between the medical ship and the advancing wall of bioships. It was a single destroyer against an ocean, a pebble trying to hold back a flood. And then Captain Thao opened fire. The Resolve's railguns hammered the swarm's front line with a steady rhythm of destruction, punching holes in bioships that closed almost as fast as they were made. Missiles screamed from the ship's launch tubes, detonating in clusters that lit up the void like short-lived stars. Point defense systems swatted down spore clouds and parasitic swarms with precise bursts of energy. For the first hour, it almost worked. The swarm's advance slowed, confused by the intensity of fire coming from such a small ship. The bioships in the lead kept trying to push forward, and the Resolve kept killing them, piling up wreckage in a growing barrier of dead flesh and broken chitin. But the swarm adapted, the way it always did. They began attacking from above and below simultaneously, forcing the Resolve to split its fire. They launched gravity wells in patterns designed to twist the destroyer's hull. They sent swarms of microorganisms through the gaps in its armor, tiny creatures that chewed through wiring and clogged ventilation systems. By the second hour, the Resolve had lost its port railgun battery and half its missile tubes. By the third hour, the forward shields had failed completely. By the fourth hour, the bridge had been breached by a spore cloud that melted through the viewport, killing 6 crew members and forcing Thao to relocate to the auxiliary command center deep in the ship's core. She kept fighting. By the fifth hour, the Resolve was burning. Fires raged through multiple decks, the engines were running at dangerous levels, and the ammunition stores were nearly empty. Thao herself had taken shrapnel to her left arm, and she had tied it off with a strip of her uniform, and continued giving orders as if nothing had happened. The Grace was still behind them, still safe, still running toward the Terran lines, with 12,000 souls aboard. "Captain," Park said, and his voice was quiet now, quiet the way people get when they know how a story ends. "Weapons are almost dry. Engines are critical. We have maybe 20 minutes before the hull gives out entirely." Thao looked at the tactical display. The Grace was 19 minutes from reaching the safety of the Terran perimeter. 1 minute short. She made her decision without hesitation. "Helm, set collision course for the lead bioship. Ram speed. All hands, this is the captain. It has been an honor. Abandoned ship is not an option. There is no time. But know that what we do now matters. The Grace will make it, because we did not leave." The Resolve surged forward on its dying engines, accelerating toward the largest bioship in the swarm's front line, a creature the size of a mountain, its maw open wide to consume whatever came near. The destroyer hit it at full speed, driving its armored prow deep into the creature's intake, wedging itself into the opening like a cork in a bottle. The bioship thrashed and screamed, but the Resolve held, its hull fused into the creature's flesh by the heat of impact. The intake was blocked, and the bioships behind it could not pass. The wreckage created a wall that the swarm would need precious minutes to clear. Minutes, the grace needed. Captain Thau's last transmission was picked up by every ship in the Terran fleet and every sensor in Concord space. It was short, and it was steady, and it carried no fear. Tell them we held. Then the resolve went silent. The Grace reached the Terran perimeter with 3 minutes to spare. 12,000 refugees, including 4,000 children, were safe because one ship and one crew had decided that they mattered more than survival. The transmission spread across the galaxy like wildfire. Tell them we held. The Rafani ambassador heard it in his private chambers on Haventhos, and he sat in silence for a very long time, staring at the wall with his magnificent feathers pressed flat against his body. The Rafani equivalent of shame. Then he picked up his communicator and authorized the deployment of the entire Rithani fleet. The Corvalli Queen Mother heard it in her hive, surrounded by 1 billion of her children, and she gave the order to convert every factory on every Corvalli world to weapons production. Terran weapons, designed from schematics that humanity had already shared freely with any species willing to use them. The Dayuan Collective heard it in their deep ocean, and the ancient telepaths who had spent millennia in meditation rose from their stillness and offered something they had never offered to anyone before: the ability to reach into the swarm's neural network and jam its communications. One by one, species that had been sitting on the sidelines stood up. Counselor Opaline heard the transmission aboard a Concorde transport vessel, and she wept openly, not for Captain Thau, though she mourned her deeply, but for her own people, who had begged for this kind of courage, almost been denied. At peace, she made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She contacted Admiral Drennan directly and asked to come aboard a Terran warship. "I want to be there," she told him, her crystalline voice thin but unwavering. "My people have no claws, no war songs, no word for fury. But you have shown us what it looks like. We will learn." Drennan accepted without hesitation. Within 48 hours, the largest fleet in galactic history had assembled. Terran warships at the core, surrounded by Rithani interceptors, Corvalli heavy cruisers, Dayun signal-jamming vessels, and ships from dozens of other species who had finally found the courage to act. Admiral Drennan stood on the bridge of the Argos and addressed the combined fleet. His words were broadcast to every ship, every species, every language simultaneously. "We were born on a world that tried to kill us every day," he said. "It gave us storms and predators and plagues and ice ages, and we are still here. Not because we are the strongest, not because we are the smartest, but because we are the most stubborn things the universe has ever produced. Today, we share that stubbornness with every species standing beside us. Today, we are not Terran, not Veolith, not Rithani, not Corvalli. Today, we are all Deathworlders." The fleet advanced toward the Nexus Heart, 1,000 species flying in formation for the first time in galactic history. And at the front, as always, were the humans, the ones who had answered first, the ones who had bled first, the ones who had shown the galaxy that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward anyway. And somewhere in the wreckage behind them, the broken hull of the UTCN Resolve still held its position, wedged into the body of a dead bioship, a monument that no one had built, but everyone would remember. Tell them we held. The Nexus Heart sat at the center of the swarm, like a tumor at the center of a body, pulsing with a deep amber light that could be seen from 1,000,000 kilometers away. It was the size of a gas giant, a living structure of fused biomechanical tissue, wrapped in layer after layer of organic armor, surrounded by the densest concentration of bioships that any scanner had ever recorded. It was the brain of the swarm, the source of every command, every instinct, every coordinated movement, that had driven billions of creatures across the galaxy in an endless tide of hunger. And the combined fleet of 1,000 species was heading straight for it. Admiral Drennan looked at the tactical display and felt the weight of what was about to happen settle onto his shoulders like iron. The fleet had already lost a third of its total strength just reaching this point. Terran ships, Rithani interceptors, Corvalli cruisers, all of them shattered and scattered across the void behind them. Every kilometer they had gained had been paid for in blood. But they had gained it, and they were here, and they were not turning back. "All ships," Drennan said into the fleet-wide channel, "this is it. The heart is directly ahead. All combat groups, execute Attack Plan Omega. Clear me a path to that thing." The fleet split into 3 formations. The Rithani and Corvalli formed the outer ring, engaging the swarm's defensive perimeter with everything they had. The Daeun signal jammers moved into position, their telepathic arrays sending disruption pulses into the swarm's neural network, causing bioships to twitch, stall, and crash into each other. And the Terran core fleet drove forward through the center, a spear aimed at the heart of a god. The battle was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Bioships the size of mountains threw themselves at the fleet in waves so thick that the void itself seemed to be made of teeth and claws. Gravity wells tore ships apart. Spore clouds dissolved hulls. Parasitic swarms bored through armor and consumed crews from the inside. But the fleet held, not because they were invincible, but because they refused to stop. Every time a ship fell, the others closed the gap. Every time a formation broke, it reformed. The Rithani fought with a ferocity that surprised even themselves, their sleek interceptors darting through swarm formations with a grace that turned warfare into something almost beautiful. The Corvalli heavy cruisers soaked up damage that would have destroyed lesser ships, their armored hulls scarred and burning, but still advancing. The Daeun kept jamming, their telepaths bleeding from the effort, some of them dying at their stations, with their minds still connected to the swarm's neural network. And at the front, always at the front, the Terran warships burned a path through the living darkness like torches in a cave. The outer defenses of the Nexus Heart began to crumble. "We have a breach!" Commander Hale shouted from the tactical station. "Sector 7, the Corvalli have punched through the outer shell. There is an opening." Drennan turned to his communications officer. "Signal Lieutenant Vasquez. Her team is go. Launch the strike shuttle now." Deep in the belly of the Argos, Lieutenant Roa Vasquez stood in the airlock of an assault shuttle with 18 Marines, the survivors of her original team, plus replacements drawn from the toughest soldiers in the fleet. They were armed with everything humanity had: plasma cutters, demolition charges, heavy weapons, and the kind of grim determination that came from knowing what was at stake. "We all saw what is inside these things," Vasquez said to her team, her voice flat and hard. "We all saw the faces in the walls, the people who were absorbed, the species that were eaten alive and never allowed to die. The swarm did that to them because nobody stopped it. We are going to stop it. Today, right now, in the next hour. Any questions?" Silence. "Good. Mount up." The shuttle launched through the breach in the Nexus Heart's outer shell, dodging defensive tendrils and acid jets, and crashed through the inner membrane into the heart of the living structure. Inside, the Nexus Heart was a cathedral of horror. The walls were made of fused organic matter, billions of absorbed organisms, compressed into a single living mass that pulsed and breathed with a slow, ancient rhythm. Neural pathways the width of rivers ran through the tissue, carrying signals that coordinated the entire swarm across light years of space. The air was thick and hot, and smelled of something that Vasquez could only describe as grief. A chemical signature of billions of absorbed minds, crying out in the only way they still could. The Marines moved through the organic tunnels, fighting every step of the way. The heart's immune system attacked them. White blood cells the size of dogs, acid-spitting tendrils, gravity pockets that tried to crush them flat. They lost 4 Marines in the first 10 minutes, then 2 more in the next 5. But they kept moving deeper. And then they reached the core. It was a chamber the size of a stadium, lit by a pulsing amber glow that seemed to come from everywhere at once. At its center floated a massive structure of neural tissue. A brain, essentially, but incomprehensibly large, tangled and folded in on itself like a knot made of thought. And within that brain, Vasquez found the truth. Her scanner detected a consciousness, not the collective hive mind of the swarm, but something older, something original, something that had been buried beneath billions of absorbed minds for thousands of years. It was the remnant of the species that had started all of this, the Cathara. The Cathara had been a civilization once, a real civilization, with art and music and philosophy and love. They had been brilliant, curious, ambitious, and they had been afraid of death. So they had built the biomechanical fusion technology that was supposed to make them immortal, to merge their minds into a collective that would never age, never forget, never lose anyone. It had worked, technically, but they had not anticipated what would happen next. The collective grew hungry, always hungry, needing more matter, more energy, more minds to sustain itself. It consumed their world, then their system, then their neighbors, and with each species it absorbed, it grew larger and hungrier and less capable of stopping. The original Catharan consciousness was still in there, still aware, still remembering what it had once been. But it was buried beneath 11,000 years of screaming minds and consumed worlds, powerless to stop what it had become. And it was in agony. Vasquez could feel it through her scanner. Not words, not language, but a raw emotional signal so powerful that it made her knees buckle. It was sorrow and regret and shame, and the most desperate bone-deep longing for it all to end. The Cathara did not want to be saved. They wanted to be stopped. Diaz, Vasquez said, and her voice was thick with something she refused to call tears. Plant the charges on the primary neural clusters, all of them. Rig them for remote detonation. Lieutenant, are we sure about this? They are begging us, Corporal. Can you not feel it? Plant the charges. The Marines worked fast, placing demolition charges on every major neural junction in the core chamber. The Catharan consciousness pulsed around them, and Vasquez could swear she felt something like gratitude washing through the chamber. A warmth that had no source, a sigh from something that had been holding its breath for millennia. Outside, the battle raged. The combined fleet was taking devastating losses, but they held the breach open, pouring fire into the Nexus Heart's defenses with everything they had left. The Argos itself was burning, its port side torn open by a gravity well, but it kept firing, kept fighting, kept holding the line. Vasquez's team reached the shuttle with seconds to spare. They launched out of the Heart's interior and transmitted the detonation signal to Admiral Drennan. Charges are set, Admiral. The Heart is ready to die. Drennan looked at the display one last time, at the amber glow pulsing at the center of all that darkness, and he gave the order. All ships fall back to minimum safe distance. Fire the gravitic implosion warheads, everything we have, directly into the core, and detonate the charges simultaneously. The fleet pulled back, and the warheads launched, humanity's secret weapons, designed in the darkest laboratories of the Blackfall Protocol, capable of creating artificial gravitational singularities that collapsed matter into itself. 12 of them streaked toward the Nexus Heart, followed by the detonation signal for Vasquez's charges. The Heart died screaming. The implosion warheads hit first, crushing the outer layers inward with the force of a collapsing star. Then, the demolition charges fired, shattering the neural core from the inside. The Nexus Heart folded in on itself, layer after layer of living tissue, compressing into a single point of light that burned brighter than any sun, for one terrible, beautiful moment, and then it was gone. Across the galaxy, billions of bioships shuddered simultaneously. Their coordination vanished in an instant, their movements becoming random, chaotic, purposeless. They crashed into each other, drifted into space, and began to shut down one by one, like candles being snuffed out across an endless dark room. The screaming in the neural network, the voices of 1,000 absorbed civilizations, finally, mercifully, went silent. The swarm was dead. The silence that followed was the deepest silence the galaxy had ever known. In the weeks that came after, the galaxy mourned. 14 species had lost their entire fleets. Humanity had sacrificed 40% of its navy. Tens of thousands of lives had been spent to buy a future that the dead would never see. But the mourning was mixed with something else, something new, something that had never existed in the Concord before. A memorial was built in orbit above Sulara. A Terran destroyer's hull fragment fused with Velith crystal, spinning slowly in the light of the Sularan sun. On its surface, in every language spoken by every species in the Concord, were engraved 4 words. Tell them we held. Counselor Opaline addressed the Concord High Assembly one final time. She stood at her podium, her crystalline body catching the light, and she spoke with a voice that did not tremble. We called for help, she said. 1,000 species heard us. One answered, and because of them, 1,000 species found the courage to follow. That is what Deathworlders are. Not monsters, not brutes, not the dangerous creatures we whispered about in fear. They are the ones who run toward the fire. And we will never forget what that looks like. The assembly rose. Every species, every delegate, every ambassador, and they stood in silence for the dead, for the living, and for the world that had been saved because someone had been stubborn enough to fight for it. Far from Haventhos, in orbit above the memorial, Admiral Drennan stood alone at a viewport, watching the crystal and metal spin in the starlight. He had not slept in days, and his face looked older than it had a month ago. Not tired exactly, but heavy, the way a face gets when it has seen too much and cannot unsee any of it. Ambassador Elena Voss found him there, and stood beside him in silence for a while. "Are you all right?" she finally asked. He thought about the question for a long time. "They will forget," he said quietly. "Eventually, they will go back to their paradise worlds and their committee meetings and their fear of us. They will forget what we did here." Voss smiled, a small, knowing smile that held no bitterness. Only the calm certainty of someone who understood the way the universe worked. "Maybe," she said. "But the next time something comes out of the dark, they will call us again." Drennan nodded, and something in his eyes shifted. Not quite peace, but something close to it. Like a soldier putting down his rifle and knowing he would have to pick it up again someday. "And we will answer," he said. The stars burned on, and the memorial turned slowly in the light. And somewhere on a small blue world on the inner spiral arm, a species that had been forged by suffering and sharpened by survival went on doing what it had always done, watching the dark, listening for the signal, and waiting to be needed again. Because that was what Deathworlders did. They answered.